On the 1st of September 1991, 3 experienced cave divers descended into a narrow underwater passage on the French Mediterranean coast near Marseille, chasing a discovery that had already cost one diver his life weeks earlier. They never resurfaced. It would be one of the deadliest known accidents in the history of cave exploration, and it happened while investigating an entrance that had been found by complete accident just 2 months before by a diving instructor named Cosquer, who had stumbled onto a narrow shaft sitting 37 meters below the surface of the sea. Cosquer followed that shaft, expecting nothing more than another empty limestone tunnel. Instead, after swimming through more than 100 meters of flooded passage in complete darkness, he surfaced inside a massive dry chamber that no human being had set foot in for over 19,000 years. And on the walls around him, untouched by sunlight, seawater, or human hands for nearly 20 millennia, were paintings. Horses, ibex, ox, seals, and handprints, dozens of them, some so crisp and so perfectly preserved that individual fingerprint ridges were still visible pressed into the stone, as if the artist had only just lifted their palm away. What researchers found when they began carefully studying, those prints didn't just tell them what these ancient people painted, it told them, with startling precision, who some of them actually were. And one particular set of markings, tucked high on a wall in a hard-to-reach section of the cave, pointed to something almost nobody expected, that at least one of the artists working in this flooded, freezing, pitch-black cave 27,000 years ago may have been a child. To understand why a handprint or a smear of fingertip marks in soft cave clay can tell scientists something as specific as age, you first need to understand what these markings actually are and how remarkably well limestone caves preserve them. The cave in question, now known to the world as Cosquer Cave, formed the way most French Ice Age painted caves formed, carved slowly out of limestone bedrock by underground water over hundreds of thousands of years. Deep inside these cave systems, conditions barely change at all, not season to season, not century to century, sometimes not even millennium to millennium. Stable temperature, stable humidity, near total darkness, and almost no air movement. It's an environment so undisturbed that a fingerprint pressed into a thin film of soft mineral deposit called moon milk, or a line drawn with a fingertip through a layer of clay-like sediment on a cave wall, can survive essentially untouched for tens of thousands of years, protected the entire time by the same rock that swallowed it. When later Ice Age flooding sealed the entrance of Cosquer Cave under rising sea levels roughly 19,000 years ago, it accidentally created one of the most perfectly preserved time capsules in the archaeological record, a chamber untouched by erosion. Animals, or later human visitors, sealed shut until a diver with a flashlight found the one narrow crack that led back inside. Once inside, archaeologists led by prehistorian Jean Klotz began the painstaking work of documenting everything on those walls, and what emerged was one of the richest known collections of hand stencils and hand-related markings anywhere in the world. Over 100 handprints and hand stencils have now been identified throughout the cave's chambers, created using a technique that shows up again and again across Ice Age Europe, where an artist presses a hand flat against the rock and then blows pigment, likely through a hollow bone or reed across the palm and fingers, leaving behind a ghostly negative silhouette on the stone once the hand is pulled away. Some of these stencils in Cosquer are so detailed that you can make out not just the outline of the hand, but fine creases in the palm and clearly defined fingertip ridges, an almost unbearably intimate level of preservation, considering the age involved. And scattered elsewhere through the cave are simpler, less deliberate markings entirely. Finger tracings and flutings, lines dragged directly through soft mineral film on the ceiling and walls by people moving through the cave with a torch, sometimes decorative, sometimes seemingly just idle marks left by someone's hand brushing the rock as they passed by in the dark. It's here that the science gets genuinely fascinating, because researchers studying caves like this one across France have developed methods to extract an enormous amount of biological information from what looks, at first glance, like nothing more than a smudge. The relationship between finger length, hand width, and human age is remarkably consistent and well documented in modern populations. And researchers, including Cambridge archaeologist Jessica Cooney and her collaborator Leslie Van Gelder, built on this by measuring the width of the 3 middle fingers across many thousands of living people of known age, creating a detailed reference chart mapping finger width to age with real statistical confidence. When that same measuring technique is applied to ancient finger flutings and fingertip impressions preserved in cave clay, researchers can estimate, often within a fairly narrow range, roughly how old the person who made that mark actually was, and in cases where the impression is clear enough, they can even estimate biological sex with something like 80% accuracy, since male and female finger proportions differ in measurable, consistent ways, even in childhood. Applying this method at Rouffignac Cave, roughly 300 kilometers, north of Cosquer, in the Dordogne region, Researchers were able to identify specific individual children whose markings appeared repeatedly throughout the cave, including work attributed to a child as young as 3 years old and a particularly prolific young artist, estimated to have been around 5, whose markings turn up again and again across different chambers. Cosquer Cave itself has produced its own version of this exact discovery, documented high on one of the cave's walls in a location that would have required an adult to lift a small child up, or for the child to have climbed to a genuinely difficult and physically demanding height. Researchers identified a handprint whose proportions are consistent with a young child rather than an adolescent or adult. It sits among the far larger, more assured hand stencils clearly made by grown members of the group. A small print in the middle of an otherwise adult composition, a single physical trace of a child who was, for reasons we can only guess at now, brought into one of the most inaccessible and dangerous spaces their community regularly used, deep underground, past a long stretch of pitch darkness, specifically to leave a mark on that wall. That detail alone raises an obvious and slightly unsettling question. Cosquer Cave, in its current form, is only reachable through a genuinely hazardous flooded tunnel, one that killed 3 trained modern scuba divers with full equipment in 1991. But 27,000 years ago, before the post-Ice Age sea level rise flooded that entrance passage, the cave would have been accessible by foot, though almost certainly still through long stretches of total darkness, tight passages, and physically demanding terrain, the kind of environment that would have required real determination, real risk tolerance, and quite possibly the assistance of at least one adult to bring a small child into. So why do it at all? Why carry, coax, or walk a 2, 3, or 5-year-old through hundreds of meters of freezing dark limestone passage, far from any natural light, just to leave a single small handprint on a wall alongside horses, seals, and ox? The dating itself is worth pausing on because Cosquer Cave turns out to have been used across 2 distinct and widely separated periods, something researchers only figured out by carefully studying which images were painted over which. The earliest phase, the one containing the hand stencils and finger tracings, including the child's handprint, has been radiocarbon dated to roughly 27,000 years ago, placing it within the Gravettian period, a culture spread across Ice Age. Europe known for finely made stone tools, ivory carving, and some of the earliest known figurative art anywhere on the continent. A second, later phase of activity, radiocarbon dated to around 19,000 years ago, added most of the more detailed animal engravings and paintings, the horses, ibex, and the unusual marine creatures that make Cosquer so distinctive among French decorated caves. Unlike the more famous inland caves such as Lascaux or Chauvet, Cosquer sits in a location that would have been well inland from the Miami coastline during the depths of the last ice age, when so much of the planet's water was locked into glaciers that global sea levels sat more than 100 meters lower than they do today. That's precisely why its walls preserve seals, great auks, and other marine and coastal species, almost never found in cave art anywhere else in France. A direct artistic record of a coastline that has since vanished underwater, discovered only because a diver happened to find the one narrow crack in the rock that still led back to dry land. If you've ever found yourself wondering why anyone would go to such lengths for something that looks, on the surface, so simple, that's exactly the kind of buried mystery this channel exists to dig into. So if this is your first time here, consider subscribing, because the explanation researchers have proposed for this pattern is stranger and more moving than most people expect. This is where the story widens out beyond just Cosquer Cave, because the presence of children deep inside painted caves turns out to be an enormous and consistent pattern across the entire archaeological record of Ice Age Europe, not an isolated oddity. Researchers studying roughly 400 known painted caves across France and Spain, spanning a period between 40,000 and 12,000 years ago, have documented clear evidence of children's participation at site after site, sometimes through handprints and finger flutings, sometimes through preserved footprints in cave floor sediment. At Rouffignac, in the chamber researchers call the Cave of 100 Mammoths, children as young as 2 to 5 years old left flutings not just at ground level, but high on walls and even across ceilings, in spots that would have required them to be lifted onto an adult's shoulders or held up bodily to reach. At Gargas Cave, further south in the French Pyrenees, one particularly striking wall preserves the stenciled image of a baby's hand held inside the hand of an adult, while pigment was blown across, both at once, single frozen gesture of physical closeness between a grown artist and an infant, intentionally preserved in pigment for reasons we can only interpret now, tens of thousands of years later. At Cosquer Cave in Italy, footprints belonging to children roughly 14,000 years old have been found deep in total darkness, evidence that these children weren't simply present near a cave entrance, but were making their way through the deepest, most physically demanding interior chambers. And at Las Monedas Cave in Spain, Researchers have identified charcoal drawings made by children as distinct from adult work, not just through size and finger proportions, but by their physical placement positioned lower on the walls, closer to the ground where a small child could actually reach, in a separate section of the cave, from the more elaborate, technically skilled compositions attributed to adults, and showing developmental patterns that mirror the same stages modern children pass through as their fine motor control matures. Some researchers who have studied this pattern closely have gone so far as to estimate, based on the demographic makeup of skeletal remains and campsites from this period, that children and adolescents may have made up somewhere close to 40% of the total Upper Paleolithic population, since Ice Age hunter-gatherer societies, like most pre-industrial populations, skewed dramatically younger than modern societies do. In some individually studied decorated caves, researchers estimate that children accounted for as much as a quarter or more of everyone who physically entered and left a mark, a proportion far higher than most casual visitors. To a museum exhibit on cave art would ever assume, since museum reconstructions and popular imagery have overwhelmingly focused on a single archetype, the solitary adult hunter, crouched by torchlight, painting a bison alone. It also helps to place Cosquer within a much longer, much stranger timeline of human mark-making, because the impulse to press a hand or a finger into soft material and leave something behind clearly goes back far deeper than any Homo sapiens site in France. Researchers studying a cave on the Tibetan Plateau have identified a set of preserved hand and footprints, deliberately arranged, rather than randomly scattered, that may be roughly 200,000 years old, and were possibly made by children belonging to an entirely different hominin lineage altogether, long before modern humans had even reached that part of the world. Separate research on Neanderthal sites has pushed the timeline further still, with finger-drawn engravings recently identified in a French cave and sealed off from the outside world for an estimated 57,000 years, alongside earlier claims of Neanderthal-made cave paintings in Spain dated to roughly 65,000 years, which would place them tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens is thought to have arrived in Western Europe at all. Even further back, researchers have documented a deliberately etched zigzag pattern carved into a shell by Homo erectus, a different and much older human relative, more than 500,000 years ago. None of these earlier examples involve children specifically, and some remain genuinely debated within the field, but together they paint a picture of an impulse toward deliberate mark-making, toward leaving some kind of intentional trace on the world that appears to run through multiple different human species, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years before a small child ever pressed a palm against the wall of Cosquer Cave. So why bring children into these spaces at all, particularly into the most remote, difficult, and objectively dangerous sections of these caves, deep past any natural light? For a long time, the leading explanation among archaeologists was fairly straightforward and practical. Children were brought along to learn. Cave art, in this view, functioned as a form of cultural education, a way of passing down not just artistic technique, but the shared symbolic and spiritual traditions of the group, with children present to observe, imitate, and eventually inherit the practice themselves, the same way a child today might be brought along to a family workshop or ceremony to absorb skills and meaning simply through repeated exposure. There's good evidence supporting this. Some of the children's markings at Rouffignac and elsewhere sit directly alongside more skilled adult work, suggesting the two were made in the same sessions, possibly even at the same time. But in 2025, a team of researchers at Tel Aviv University, led by Ella Asaf, Dr. Yafit Kedar, and Professor Ron Barkai, proposed something considerably more striking. Drawing on ethnographic comparisons with cultures around the world, including Maya, Inca, and various Native American traditions, all of which historically treated caves as thresholds between the physical world and a spiritual underworld, the researchers argued that young children in these Paleolithic societies may have been understood to hold a special, almost liminal status, existing on the boundary between the world they had just recently arrived from, before birth, and the world they now lived in as small children. In many of these later documented cultures, this in-between status was believed to make very young children uniquely capable of communicating with entities and forces from the spiritual realm, exactly the kind of forces many ancient societies believed could be contacted from deep inside a cave. Under this hypothesis, bringing a toddler or young child into the deepest, darkest chamber of a cave wasn't simply a matter of education or supervision. It may have been a deliberate ritual act, one that specifically required the presence of a small child precisely because of what that child was believed to represent. A bridge, a messenger, a uniquely qualified intermediary standing between two worlds in a place already understood as a doorway between them. Whether or not that specific spiritual interpretation is correct, and it remains a genuinely debated hypothesis rather than settled fact, the underlying physical evidence is not in dispute. Children were there. Not occasionally, not as an afterthought trailing behind adults, but repeatedly across dozens of sites spanning tens of thousands of years, leaving marks in some of the most remote and difficult to reach spaces these communities ever used. And the technical evidence backing this up has become remarkably rigorous. Finger fluting analysis at this point isn't guesswork or wishful pattern matching. It rests on measurable, statistically validated relationships between finger width and age, calibrated against thousands of modern reference samples, cross-checked against the physical placement of markings relative to the ground, and, in the strongest cases, corroborated by actual preserved footprints belonging to children found in the same sediment layers as the handprints and flutings themselves. Not every researcher agrees on every detail. Some archaeologists have pushed back specifically on how precisely an artist's exact age can be pinned down from finger width alone, arguing the margin of error is wider than some studies imply. But painted hand stencils, where an entire palm and finger set is preserved in far more anatomical detail than a simple dragged line, offer considerably more concrete evidence, and it's exactly this kind of stencil, high on a wall inside Cosquer Cave, that provides some of the clearest physical proof anywhere in the archaeological record that a child's hand helped shape one of humanity's earliest known works of art. There's also a genuinely eerie layer sitting alongside all of this, one that Cosquer Cave shares with several other painted caves across France and Spain. Among the more than 200 hand stencils documented across roughly 7 major sites, including Cosquer, Gargas, and Maltravieso in Spain, a striking number, appear to be missing one or more fingers, showing shortened or absent digits pressed into the pigment outline. For decades, the leading explanations were mundane: frostbite, accidental injury, or simply fingers folded backward out of view during the stenciling process, a kind of ancient sign language captured mid-gesture. But in more recent research, led by archaeologist Mark Collard at Simon Fraser University, presented at a meeting of the European Society for Human Evolution, researchers proposed a considerably darker possibility, that at least some of these missing digits reflect deliberate ritual amputation, a practice, documented ethnographically in a number of more recent cultures as an act tied to grief, sacrifice, or attempts to petition supernatural forces. That interpretation remains contested. Other specialists, including Durham University archaeologist Paul Pettit, have pushed back hard against it, arguing the folded finger explanation still fits the evidence better and calling aspects of the ritual amputation theory unconvincing. But it's a reminder that even a single handprint pressed into 27,000-year-old stone can carry layers of meaning and mystery that modern researchers are still actively arguing over layer by layer, finger by finger. There's one more layer to this worth sitting with, because it changes how you look at every single handprint in a cave like Cosquer, not just the one belonging to a child. Jean Klotz, the prehistorian who led the original study of the cave, has described the effect of standing in front of these stencils in almost personal terms, noting how the hands seem to hover disembodied against the rock, each one representing a genuinely individual act carried out by a specific person on a specific day, rather than an anonymous cultural output. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem to. It's easy to think about cave art in the abstract as a kind of collective artifact belonging to an entire culture or era, the way we might think about a language or a tool-making tradition. But a hand stencil doesn't work that way. It's a direct physical impression of one particular person's actual body, preserved down to the ridges of their fingerprints in a way that a stone tool or a pottery shard simply can't replicate. When researchers can further narrow that impression down to a specific estimated age, and in some cases a probable sex, the abstraction collapses even further. It stops being cave art created by Paleolithic people in general and becomes, quite specifically, a mark left by one particular child on one particular day, deep inside one particular cave, for reasons that child could never have explained to us even if we could somehow ask. That specificity is also why researchers are careful not to overstate what any single handprint can prove. A child's presence in a cave doesn't tell us whether that child was there willingly, whether the visit was routine or exceptional, or whether the same child ever returned. It doesn't tell us the child's name, their family, or what happened to them afterward. What it tells us, with a level of physical certainty that few other kinds of prehistoric evidence can match, is simply that they were there, in that exact spot, at that exact moment, thousands of years before anyone would think to wonder about it. Everything beyond that, the ritual explanations, the educational explanations, the spiritual liminality proposed by the Tel Aviv University team, remains interpretation built carefully on top of a single, undeniable physical fact. What all of this adds up to, when you step back from the specifics of any one cave, is a picture of Ice Age society that looks considerably less like the lone hunter with a torch image most of us grew up with, and considerably more like something recognizably communal, intergenerational, and, in its own way, deeply tender. These weren't spaces reserved exclusively for skilled adult specialists working in isolation. They were spaces where entire communities, adults and children together, made the difficult, sometimes genuinely dangerous journey into total darkness, for reasons that blended practical skill sharing with something that looks a great deal like ritual, memory, and belonging. A small handprint pressed high on a wall inside Cosquer Cave, in a spot that took real effort to reach, isn't an accident or a footnote. It's a signature, left by someone who almost certainly had no concept that their single fleeting gesture made in total darkness beside images of horses and seals and auks would still be legible to another set of eyes 27,000 years later, eyes belonging to a species that would eventually build submarines, diving equipment, and underwater flashlights, specifically to come looking for it. And that's really the strangest part of this entire story, stranger even than the fingerprints themselves, somewhere in that flooded cave off the coast of Marseille, alongside animals painted by hands that clearly knew exactly what they were doing. There's a small handprint that most likely belongs to a child who never could have imagined being found, studied, measured, and written about by people living in an unimaginably distant future. That child, whoever they were, left behind the oldest, kind of proof there is that they existed at all. Not a name, not a story, just a hand, pressed once against cold stone in the dark and somehow against every possible odd. It survived long enough for us to notice it too. It's worth remembering too, just how narrow the odds actually were. For that handprint to survive at all, the cave had to remain sealed and undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. For it to ever be found, a diving instructor exploring an entirely unrelated stretch of coastline had to notice one unusually narrow crack in the rock. On a day he easily could have swum right past it. And for scientists to eventually be able to say anything meaningful about the person who made it, an entirely separate and much more recent branch of research measuring the finger widths of thousands of ordinary people alive today, had to exist first, purely so it could be turned backward in time and pointed at a single mark in French limestone. Strip away any one of those pieces, the sealed cave, the lucky diver, the modern reference data, and that child's handprint would simply be one more anonymous smear in the dark, indistinguishable from the hundreds of other marks left on those same walls. Instead, through an almost absurd chain of coincidence, geology, and modern statistical method, it became something else entirely. A genuine, individually identifiable trace of a specific human being who lived and breathed and reached out a small hand toward a cave wall, 27,000 years before anyone would ever think to look for them.